This episode's kind of topical, going off of the last one about choices and whether or not they actually matter in the grand scheme of a game. But I was reminded shortly afterwards of the very first Final Fantasy game, which, as it happens, was the first Final Fantasy I ever played. A lot of people I know started off with 7 or 8. But I got to start at ground zero. I remember getting a CD that had 1 and 2 on it. It was for the PS1. Yeah. And I figured, well, might as well start at number 1. 2 ended up being my favorite game, but we'll get to that one later. And there was an interesting narrative in the first game where you chose your party of heroes, either white mage, black mage, red mage, thief, I think monk, warrior, and I feel like I'm forgetting somebody. But you could make it however you want. Who the characters were and what their classes weren't very important. Although I'm pretty sure you could create a party that would leave you boned for the entire game. I'm getting off topic here. The whole point of the story was that these were 4 warriors of light. Each one held a crystal. And within the story of the game, this was a point within this fantasy world where the light had gone out of these crystals, and they were like a balancing force. And they were the usual elements like water, earth, wind, and fire. And you had to reignite each of these crystals by traveling around the land, defeating monsters that had corrupted the area that you were in, and by doing so, reigniting the crystal to restore order. That was the very basic plot of the game. But I believe... No, actually, it was right off the beginning. You run into this guy who... I'm trying to remember his name now. Hold on. Garland. I think his name was Garland. He was a knight that had kidnapped the princess of this first castle he had come across. The king's like, save the princess. We've all been there before. So you do that, you beat him, and he's like a throwaway villain. But by the end of the game, he ends up becoming the main antagonist who... And I'm really trying to draw off of memory here without looking up references. I believe he had somehow allied himself with gods of chaos to create this kind of infinite time loop so that he could be immortal and never actually die. So, I know it sounds very convoluted and complicated. The point of it was, eventually, your heroes, who are boss at this point in the game, have to fight Garland, who has been empowered by chaos into this super ultra boss demon fuck you uppercuss guy, and defeat him. But in doing so, I think he had created, with all the wibbly wobbly timey wimey stuff, he had basically become a focal point of this time paradox he created. And by defeating him at a point, I think before he had become a god of chaos, I'm really trying to remember this part, you'd collapse this sort of paradox he created. And the ending of the game was really sad, but also kind of noble. Because you'd restored the light to all the crystals, so the world had been saved. But there was this whole time paradox issue to deal with. So, by going back in time, so to speak, and defeating Garland, you had kind of removed yourself from the timeline to achieve this goal. So by defeating him and restoring order, you had effectively erased your characters from time. And that was where the ending of the game was sad, because you had achieved what you'd set out to do. The heroes completed their quest. They'd restored the light to the crystals, and then by solving this time-altering paradox, they'd remove themselves from that timeline, from reality. So the world had been saved, but the heroes had never existed. And so no one would ever know the sacrifice that they made. Even though they had literally saved space and time, no one would ever remember them. They were gone. And that was kind of sad, because it made it feel like the entire quest was pointless. Meaningless, kind of like what I talked about before with choices and whether or not they affect the conclusion of the game. But then you have to consider that even though no one will remember them, no one can even be sad that they're not there anymore, they never knew they existed, their sacrifice still means something, because even though literally no one will ever know that they were there, the fact that everyone is still there, that the world exists, is their legacy. It's a tribute to the sacrifice that they made and proof that they were successful. I guess the bitter sweetness of it is that they'll never know if they were successful or not. And I guess that's kind of the sacrifice that a lot of heroes make in any story where they sacrifice themselves to try to save someone or something. They're doing it in the hope and the belief that it's going to work out, or at the very least that it's going to be meaningful and have an impact. But honestly, after that point, they're gone. Their role's been fulfilled, and they'll never know whether or not they actually succeeded. But they're throwing blind faith in on that. They're really just taking a gamble and betting on everything working out somehow, which was something that I couldn't really appreciate at the time, because back when I played this game, I had to be, I don't know, maybe 11. So didn't have as much of an understanding or an appreciation for this kind of thing. But thinking about it now, it's interesting, and honestly makes sense that the first Final Fantasy game was supposed to be the last. Not that the series ended up going that way, because we're coming up on 15 now, I think. Yeah, 15. But the first one's always going to have a special place in my mind whenever I think back on that. And again, coming off of an episode where I talked about choices, that in the end, it can mean absolutely nothing. And everything that's been built up and all the grinding, all the experience, all the growth that's been accomplished, in the end, it's not going to mean anything. Eventually, the heroes get forgotten, or maybe they're never remembered in the first place. But if they're successful in their quest and what they set out to do, or maybe if they just believe that they were successful, that's enough. And even though there's nothing left to remember them by, they still accomplish what they set out to do. Bit of a melancholy episode, I know, but I think it's something to think about. And if you've never played the first Final Fantasy game, don't think I've ruined it for you, because I'm going off of memory. Guaranteed there are huge holes in it, and I'm probably not remembering all of it 100% accurately. And it's a game worth playing, if only to see where the entire series started and see the little common links that have survived all the way up to where we are now. And who knows, 10 years from now, I bet Final Fantasy will still be going. And maybe it'll have returned to its roots in some way, just to add a little bit of freshness to the franchise. But that's something I can't really even hypothesize on right now. But anyway, if you got anything you'd like to share, comments on this, if you've played Final Fantasy, the very first one, or you have some different opinions on how you interpreted the conclusion of that game, I'd be very interested to hear that. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to share it around. Once again, my name's Rye. Take care of yourselves.